Hello and welcome to Project Noon, a platform dedicated to critically and creatively exploring Hindu-Muslim dialogue. I'm joined today again with Professor Ankur Barua, a senior lecturer in Hindu studies at Cambridge University. The topic of our discussion today is his book, The Hindu Self and Its Muslim Neighbors, Contested Borderlines on Bengali Landscapes. Now, the core of the book is a set of translations of the Bengali writings of Rabindranath Tagore, Qazi Nazrul Islam, and Annada Shankar Rai. And the professor places these writings in their socio-historical context while sketching the contours of relations between Hindus and Muslims in Bengal. Now, Professor, before we get to the main motifs of the book, what motivated you to start writing this book a few years ago?
Thank you, Saad, for inviting me for a second time to speak to Project Noon. And also, thank you for asking me that question right at the beginning. Often when we write books, we don't spell out the details of what led us to write a certain book. And sometimes because some of these details are too complicated to write out in a short preface. So let me start by saying that in one sense, this is a very deeply autobiographical book. So the title says The Hindu Self and Its Muslim Neighbors. What I really mean by that is my Hindu self and my Muslim neighbors. Now, my Hindu self, as it so happens, has certain Christian affiliations, affectivities. On a different occasion, if this were Project Omega to promote Hindu-Christian relations, I might talk about those affectivities, affiliations, but I won't. On this occasion, let me say this book is my Hindu self and my Muslim neighbors. And to take this one step forward, one theme that I've been deeply interested in for many years, many decades, is what we call, to use slightly technical language, the politics of friendship. And a question that I'm interested in exploring from multiple vantage points is this simple question in one sense: is friendship possible? And if yes, what kind of friendship is that may develop between individuals or groups or communities which are located on socio-political planes of asymmetry, hierarchy, oppression, domination, and so on. So to give you a more concrete example, the politics of friendship that I have been studying on and off for many years now is the triangular friendship between Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, and an Englishman called C.F. Andrews. And what motivated me to write a book on Tagore's Vedantic relationality about 5, 6, 7 years ago, was to understand this type of relation between Andrews and Tagore, because here is Andrews, an Englishman in 1910, 1920, who is a member of the ruling race. That is how he is viewed, although he doesn't think of himself that way. And Tagore, how Tagore is engaging with Andrews' Christian viewpoints to develop his way of being Hindu in 1920. And as part of the research for that book, I began to realize that Tagore has written significantly about Muslims, about the Hindu-Muslim question. However, in that book, Tagore's relations with Muslims gets only about 2 pages, because that was not my main focus. Now, after I finished writing that book, this thought remained at the back of my mind that, okay, Tagore has said something about Muslims. When lockdown started, one Sunday I said, okay, let me actually translate one of these articles, one of these essays. And I did this partly for one of my PhD students who was working partly on Tagore. So I said, why don't I translate this essay and send it to her? So this is what I did. And then the next day I said, well, why not the next? I translated another one. And slowly, before I realized it, in about 4 or 5 months, I translated all of Tagore's writings on Muslims in general and Muslims in Bengal in particular. And I was quite astounded by the fact that his writings on Muslims, on the Hindu-Muslim question, translated into English by me, they run into about 28,000 words. That's a huge amount of material. Only some of that is translated in my book. Now, where does this thing called, how does this thing called politics of friendship work out? Because as I said, it is a kind of semi-autobiographical book. Many years ago, when I was having a conversation with one of my mother's closest friends, who happens to be a Muslim lady, she said something to me in passing. Sometimes how when we are having a conversation and I just mention something as a footnote, but that really strikes you and so, wow. Okay. So we were talking about, I think, the hot weather or what to have for dinner or what vegetable I like or don't like. And she said this to me, that her uncle or granduncle or somebody in her family, that is somebody who was Muslim, used to refer to my granduncle not as the Hindu uncle, not as the Hindu granduncle, but the chess playing granduncle, that the one with whom this Muslim gentleman, would play chess. Now, in my book, I try to argue that we should try to avoid two kinds of bipolar representations of Hindu-Muslim relations. One is, of course, this idea that there is some kind of radical antagonism between one monolithic bloc called the Muslims out there and the Hindus out there. And sometimes to counter these kinds of monolithic bipolar antagonistic modes, people go into the other extreme. The other extreme would be to romanticize Hindu-Muslim unity as some kind of undiluted, unfragmented brotherhood and sisterhood. And whenever I think about this particular incident, which I narrated to you just now, I think, okay, am I doing the same? Am I trying to romanticize this particular affiliation, friendship that did develop? And it was very real from what she was telling me, that this Muslim gentleman would always look forward to these days on Sundays when they would play chess. Now, having spent many, many years with Muslim friends and acquaintances, I can see how the reality, the social reality, the socio-economic, the socio-political reality of Muslims in India, Muslims in South Asia is, of course, far more complicated than either of these two bipolar uh, uh, opposites would suggest. And that is the ultimate motivating force leading me to write this book, to translate all of Tagore's, some of Tagore's writings on Muslims, and Qazi Nazrul Islam, some of his writings on Hindus and Muslims, and on Noda Shankar Rai, who was an ICS officer just before independence partition. Later, he became IAS. His writings on the Hindu-Muslim question. And that is the intellectual history component of the book. And what I've done in chapter 1, 2, and the final chapter, place this intellectual history in some long-range social history trajectories. So that somebody who has not yet read these Bengali texts in translation may understand how I'm situating this Bengali text on these long-range trajectories of the Hindu-Muslim question, Hindu-Muslim antagonism, Hindu-Muslim amity. And I've showed how these relations have been alternately shaped by amity and antagonism, depending on the local context, depending on the regional development, depending on questions of language and nation state and identity. And for now, I think I will stop there because I mean I can explicate a little bit more of the things that I've said, which I will possibly do in response to some of your more detailed questions.
Right. Right. Of course, there's that you speak in the book about a dialectic between, on the one hand, a vision of austerity, and on the other hand, a vision of abundance. So can you speak a bit about that? What do you mean by these terms?
Yes. So one of the, again, many motivating forces leading me to write this book is to show how, to understand Hindu-Muslim relations, we should go beyond socio-economic history or political history or socio-cultural history, although that is very important. In fact, so important that, as I said just now, chapter 1 and 2 are devoted to laying out some of the outlines, contours of precisely that history. But we have to go beyond the socio-economic analysis or socio-political assessment to try to understand some of the cosmological visions, some of the theological underpinnings, some of the intellectual motivations that lead Hindus to represent or misrepresent Muslims in a certain way and vice versa. And this particular dialectic, which I highlight in this way, vision of abundance and vision of austerity, is one that goes all the way back to pre-modern centuries, to say the Bhagavad Gita, to the Upanishads. One could even say the Vedas, but that's like really far back, say 1500 BCE. And what I'm trying to do is to give you a view of these Hindu centuries, let's say, from 20,000 feet. Because, once you start studying Hinduism, and once you start studying Islam at the grassroots, We will need 10 lectures, 20 lectures, we will need 5 years, 10 years, and so on. But sometimes it's important to have some kind of an overview understanding of Islamic theology, Islamic life, Hindu theology, Hindu life from 20,000 feet or 10,000 feet. And this is my view of Hinduism from 10,000 feet, from 20,000 feet. In fact, I came up with these phrases, vision of abundance and vision of austerity, fairly recently. It's only about 3-4 years ago. And when I came up with these phrases, I realized that in one way, I've always been talking about these concepts without using these precise modular phrases. Okay. So what I mean by vision of austerity is this. We find this vision in certain Vedic texts, certain Vedic commentarial texts, where there is a radical opposition or polarity between the self and its other. So the self has a particular homeland, let's say Bharata. It speaks a certain language, Sanskrit, or a language that is close enough to Sanskrit. And it has this anxiety that whoever is coming into this homeland and does not speak Sanskrit is some kind of an outsider who represents undharma, not dharma, anti-dharma. So the forces of darkness, chaos, anarchy. So there's a constant tension or antagonism between dharma and adharma. So dharma is paradigmatically expressed through Sanskrit or a Sanskritic language. And ritual dharma is to be practiced and performed through certain kinds of Vedic hymns and commentaries on Vedic hymns. So this is the vision of austerity. And you can see why I call it an austere vision, because it's not capacious enough to include the other in some vision of harmony or benevolence and so on. At the same time, running alongside this first vision of austerity, and sometimes often in conflict with this vision, is a vision of abundance. And in this vision of abundance, self and other are not characterized in this dichotomous manner as radically other versus this self here, but through some form of negotiation, polarity, relationship, or interrelationality. And part of the reason why I subtitled this book on Tagore as the Vedantic relationality is just to highlight this vision of abundance. Although when I was writing that book, I did not quite have this phrase in mind, vision of abundance. So what we find in Hindu cultural landscapes, universes, 1500 years, 2000 years, let's say 1000 years, from the 11th century onwards, are two competing visions, and competing visions which are often mutually intertwined and entangled. A vision of austerity, where the other is perceived as a threat, as an alien, at best, as an alien resident, but never one who can become part of the self. Side by side with this vision of austerity as a vision of abundance, which reaches out to the other. And again, this is again not to romanticize this vision of abundance, because when I say abundance, I don't mean the abundance of heaven or paradise. It's still the abundance to be situated on Earth, a finite planet, a fragile planet with scarce resources. But the vision, if you want to call it eschatological or utopic or whatever adjective you want to use, is that of the other as somehow deeply continuous with the self. So there's some kind of deep continuity or even identity, or if that is too strong, at least an equivalence with the other. And that is the vision of abundance. And what I've tried to show in the book is how relations between Hindus and Muslims between, say, 1850 and 2002, or say 1947, 1971, 2002, have been alternatively shaped by this oscillation between a vision of abundance and a vision of austerity. Sometimes Hindus, they invoke the language of austerity and say, okay, Muslims or Christians are outsiders, or the British foreigner or the Westerner is a threat, is an outsider, is a vision of austerity. There are other Hindus, social activists, gurus, intellectuals, writers, novelists who imagine or articulate the vision of abundance and try to situate the other on the horizon of the self by saying the other is never radically other, the other is distinctly other, right? So to be able to make a distinction between difference and a binary. So say Muslims or Westerners or foreigners are distinct, they're different, but they are never radically other. So that is the vision of abundance. And that contestation, that negotiation between these two visions are refracted through prisms of socioeconomic asymmetry, socio-political hierarchy, competition for scarce resources. In this case, I mean competition for government jobs in the English lower hierarchy of British India is what I mean by English here, and so on.
Right. Uh, Well, I mean, there's of course that interesting expression of one of these visions of austerity found in that line in Savarkar's Hindutva, that nothing makes self-conscious of itself so much as a conflict with non-self. Right.
Yeah, I
So
agree. In fact, I think in my sixth chapter, when I'm talking about the vision of austerity, I think I myself quote
yes,
that line.
yes, you do mention that,
Yeah.
right? Of course.
Yeah.
Right. So, uh, I mean, is there reality to this statement? Self-consciousness requires, uh, you know, keeping the other in the set of opposition to oneself.
I mean, if by reality you mean the tragic socio-historical reality of our
Right.
planet, then of course it's yes. I mean,
Ah,
and
right.
I don't just mean Hindus and Muslims in South Asia. Like this is the history of the world for the last 3 millennia. Often it has so happened that it is only the threat of the outsider, the alien, the enemy at the gates, which has somehow forced the self to withdraw into itself, to raise the drawbridge and to go back into his fortress or citadel and say, okay, these are the outsiders, these are the enemy at the gates. So purely as a historical comment
Mm,
on how the world has been, this is one side of the history of the world. Because again, this is not to say that this is the only socio-historical reality. Because even within this fortress, to go back to my metaphor, there have been various kinds of people, if you want to call them mystics, you can call them mystics, who have proclaimed a vision of brotherhood, sisterhood, equality, identity, and say to the king or to the monarch, lower the drawbridge, let's go out, let's invite them. Yeah? So on the one hand, there is a vision of antagonism running throughout human history, and there is also a vision of invitation running throughout human history. And whether you call it a vision of abundance or austerity or vision of antagonism
mm,
or invitation, we would be roughly more or less talking about the same social historical landscapes. Right? So, and just to add to this, sometimes, of course, I mean, the threat is not real, but the threat can be constructed. The threat can be imagined and projected back into the past. Right? So, say, for example, we can have two groups, A and B, which have been living more or less in some measure of harmony, even if, to use that phrase, which is sometimes used, living together separately. Now, suppose because of socioeconomic asymmetries and sociocultural pressures, somebody in group A realizes, well, 500 years ago did not such a thing happen. And this imagination of a perceived threat can be magnified and sent back to the past and brought back to the present, right? So the point being that
mm,
the past is never past. The past is still flowing past us. And we are
right.
shaped by these long range narratives. And what we have to do is try to understand that we are in media res, to use that Latin phrase, in the middle of things. And the middle of
Mm,
things is always messy. It's not just one vision of antagonism. It's not just one vision of amity or friendship or invitation. So that's why projects of peacemaking, finding peace, are so strenuous and arduous because it requires us to, number one, go through history and understand that history is not something that happened in the past, full stop, and we are here. I mean, we are here partly because we are shaped by those historical narratives, some of which may not be even obvious to us. I mean, nobody, because we are all finite beings, we cannot pluck ourselves out of our historical locations and say, okay, because of this particular narrative, I became who I became at the age of so and so, right? So often this happens through this dialogical interplay. I tell you how I see you, and you say, really, you see me in that way? No, I'm not like this. And I tell you why I see you in that way, right? And through this mutual co-constitution, as it is sometimes called, ourself and the other, they shift positions if we are open and transparent to each other. So I would say yes and no. Sometimes human beings have become aware of who they are, sadly, tragically, only on the battlefield, right? And sometimes human beings have become aware of who they are in a temple or in a mosque or in a church or in some public square.
right. I mean, as you mentioned, the past is never, beyond us or never past us. Uh, but I mean, in these, many reconstructions of the past or reimaginings of the past, for example, I mean, such as we find in the writings of Savarkar, History is very important for someone like Savarkar to paint history in a certain way and to draw certain implications from that. But throughout this use of history, history is used throughout to give edifice to a non-historical or an ahistorical sense of self, which is not influenced by any socio-historical factors at all. Right.
Yeah, that I agree. Yeah. So,
Right.
I mean, what we keep in mind is that in one sense, history is always a history of the now. We are writing history in the now, and therefore the kind of historical narrative we develop or configure will be inflected, however much we may want to deny this point, by our present day concerns. Right. So here's somebody who has this vision of austerity, a very sharp dichotomous view of us versus them, this self-other binary. And the self that is being projected or retrojected, whichever way you want to look at the causal arrow, is one that, in one sense, that self does not have a history, is a pure Hindu self, which has existed beyond space and time, and which has been afflicted, um, attacked by various enemies, various forces. But alongside this view, as I was pointing out, there's also this view of the self as relational in the view of abundance, the view of abundance which you find in Tagore, and of course it's not limited to Tagore. I mean, you find this in a certain form in Swami Vivekananda, in Gandhi, in Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, and various other Hindu thinkers, writers, and intellectuals. I mean, all of them have their own way of configuring this vision of abundance. So we'll have to read their individual writings. But what they share in common is this idea that the Hindu self is not some kind of prefabricated thing out there. It's work in progress. And with every new generation, the question of Hindu identity has to be recapitulated, reconfigured, retested, reassessed. Yeah, so the Hindu self has a history, which, as I said, is a history of the now. And this Hindu self is shaped by its deep interrelationalities with its neighbors, to use the title of to use the word in my title, or with its interlocutors. So when we forget that history is a history of the now, we start thinking of here's the one answer for all time, and then we forget that is not actually history. That is the view of a non-history, because a historical view itself has to have a history, right? That's a kind of a meta-historical point I'm making. That then if a historical view did not itself have a history, I mean, how would it be history? Because we are historical beings. The producers are historical. Therefore, the product has to be historical.
Right. Right. And I think, I mean, these concerns about a pure ahistorical, unadulterated self, as opposed to being polluted by external or other influences. This is something which is also seen in Muslim anxieties about the self emerging in the 19th and 20th centuries. And particularly in Bengal, where you situate these key writings in the context of Hindu-Muslim relations in Bengal, you mentioned that in the first half of the 20th century, we have two central debates that are running through. There is the status of Islam vis-a-vis Hindu milieus, and then there is the discussion of the Bengali language vis-a-vis its Sanskritic roots. So we find, I suppose, similar kinds of concerns about purity and pollution over here.
Yes, I agree. I mean, these arguments, they run parallel to each other, and sometimes they feed off each other. So here's an interesting fact. You may find it interesting. So the title of the book right now is The Hindu Self and Its Muslim Neighbors. When the manuscript of this book was nearing completion about 3-4 years ago, I realized, to my shock, that even without wanting to do so, I had written a book with the title The Muslim Self and Its Hindu Neighbors.
Right.
So I had to, because I promised my publishers the title is The Hindu Self and Its Muslim Neighbors, and here is the content, here is the argument. I had to undertake this very painful process of cognitive rewiring and rewrite the final chapter, rewrite parts of the second chapter, and make certain adjustments in the main part of the book. So the very fact that I wanted to write a book titled The Hindu Self and Its Muslim Neighbors, without realizing it, unself-consciously, I had written a book called The Muslim Self and Its Hindu Neighbors. Now, the only reason why I do not want to write the second book is that to do so, I would have to quote extensively from the Quran, from Hadith, and various other texts, and I cannot read Arabic or Persian. So I do not want to do that. Let's say if I were collaborating with someone like you or somebody else, I could very well have gone ahead and just send that off. But I mean, that is just to kind of reflect your point that when you say these concerns about the pure Hindu self or the austere Hindu self and the pure Muslim self, which is to be protected, quarantined from any contamination from its neighboring Hindu milieus, this runs through various styles of Muslim preaching in Bengali and possibly even in Hindi from around that time onwards, say roughly from about 1880, 1890, 1910, 1920 onwards. And this goes hand in hand with a deep anxiety about this language called Bengali, right? So roughly by the end of the 19th century, that is 1895, 1900 onwards, this idea begins to gain ground in various elite circles of North India, Muslim elite circles of North India, that the properly authentic language of South Asia to talk about Islam is Urdu. And so, of course, the gold standard is Arabic. If you cannot do it in Arabic, okay, Persian, we may allow it. But come on, yaar, you have to speak Urdu. Right? How can you possibly speak Punjabi, Tamil, Gujarati, or Bengali? So these are local languages which are completely contaminated by Hindu idolatry. It's the language of Shirk. I mean, you don't know what is hiding inside the Bengali alphabet. Don't you know that each letter of the Bengali alphabet symbolically represents a Hindu god or goddess? Right? So this is the kind of deep anxiety that if people start talking about Islam or about the Prophet Muhammad or various aspects of Islamic practice in Bengali, which we can't read. So that is the anxiety now from the perspective of the pure, austere Muslim self, that the threat of contamination is very much here. So let's raise the drawbridge, to go back to this metaphor, antagonistic metaphor, and retreat to the pure citadel of Islam, which is ideally in Arabic, or at the most, we will make this concession called Urdu, but don't go beyond Urdu. And that is why the ethno-linguistic identity of Bengal's Muslims, Bengali Muslims, becomes such a flashpoint of controversy after 1947, right? And this is one of the many reasons leading up to the formation of Bangladesh, the nation state of Bangladesh in 1971. When you reflect on it, it raises the question, what is the primary criterion that we may use as part of our self-understanding? Is it religion? Is it region? Is it language? Or is it some complex interplay of all three? And if all three, what is the degree of weight we would give to religion over language, language over religion? Is it both religion and language? And this question has, in the time frame that I'm studying in this book, say from about 1890 to 1940, 1947, this question repeatedly comes up in these Bengali Hindu and Bengali Muslim circles. The question being, who is a Bengali Muslim really? Is a Bengali Muslim really somebody who speaks Bengali and their Islamic identity is just a footnote? Or are they really, really Muslims who just happen to pick up some Bengali down the line? Right? So are they primarily Muslims with Bengali speaking ability, or primarily Bengali speaking people with some kind of an Islamic footnote? Right? Whereas this question would not usually come up. Are Bengali Hindus really, really Bengali speakers who happen to be Hindu? Or are they really Hindus who happen to speak Bengali? So that asymmetry is part of what I was trying to indicate earlier at the beginning when I said these relations should not be romanticized, because they are patterns of conflict which are played out on uneven playing fields of, in this case, a linguistic hierarchy, right? So I mean, in some ways, we may find this all quite remarkable, that really you're going to fight about language. Can't we just translate everything into English? I mean, problem solved, right? But what we forget is that a language is not just a series of sounds we make or inscriptions we make on a piece of paper. Language is deeply encoded in the way we think. Say, I mean, I've lost my fluency in speaking Bangla, but I still read Bengali. But on occasions when I do speak in Bengali with friends, I feel a different person. I mean, I cannot talk about what I'm talking about right now to you in Bengali. I've lost that kind of fluency. But if I were to talk about, let's go and have a cup of tea, or let's talk about something happening in the world, in one sense, I become a different person when I speak Bengali as opposed to speaking English right now. Right. So language has very deep affective roots in our psyche, in our subliminal life. And for many of these Bengali Muslims I studied as part of the book, their Bengali speaking linguistic identity was not a dispensable footnote. It's not like, okay, first be Muslims, and okay, we will talk about this Bengali stuff later on. I mean, why can't you just be Muslims full stop, right? So that separation or polarity between being Muslim and being Bengali speaking was not made by some of the, or many of the Bengali writers, intellectuals I studied in the book, but it was made by some other Muslims in Bengal, and that is partly what led to this clash. So Urdu-speaking Bengali Muslims, they often belong to the elite Ashraf class, and they had come from North India, places like Lucknow, Delhi, Agra, in the 15th, 16th centuries, and they kind of looked down upon these Bengali-speaking Muslims as kind of not properly, authentically Muslim. Who knows what they do with their Hindu neighbors? I mean, when we are not looking.
Right.
So I agree. If I had known you at that time, I would have written this book, The Muslim Self and His Hindu Neighbors, and you would have helped me with all my Quranic
Right.
reference. Yeah.
Definitely. Right. Well, I mean, uh, all this is important because it sets the stage for the intervention that Nazrul Islam is making in this scene. But before we go there, uh, you know, these anxieties about, Bangla, and one's Muslim identity in relation to the language. And I mean, in general, the concern that the Muslim identity or Muslim self was being polluted by Hindu elements. For example, you mentioned in the social history which we recount that in the 18th century we have Haji Shariatullah and Sayyid Mir Nasir Ali who are raising this concern. But at around the same time, or maybe slightly before that, we also have Sayyid Sultan and his Nabi Wamsa, which is a striking example where you find a person who's writing, a classic book of the Qisasun Anbiya, the stories of the prophets, but where in his cosmology, you also find Hindu deities such as Shiva and Hari, who are expressed as an Anbiya or prophets. And the Prophet Muhammad himself is also expressed as an avatar. So you have this cross pollination of intellectual idioms happening over here. And I mean, just to recount one quote from Sayyid Sultan, where he talks about his use of such free mixing of metaphors. He says that having read the book, i.e., the Quran, when the learned man tries to explain it, how could he explain it to all the people of the land of Bonga if he were not to Indianize it? He would surely not be able to explain it to them in Arabic. The language in which the Lord has created one is one's invaluable treasure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And just to pick up that word, Indianize, which I think is in the
Indianize.
translation from Ayesha Irani, the word he would have used is some kind of Persian Arabic word like Hinduan. So again, that is another long discussion about the many meanings of the word Al-Hind, Hindu, Hind, the land of Hind. He may or may not have been talking about Hindu identity as a particular bounded religious identity. I mean, I'll have to go back and check what that verse was. But say more generally, geographically, culturally, ethnically, the land of Hind, and these people are Hinduan. So if you don't speak the language, this language, how will we make sense of what we're trying to say about the Prophet, about the Quran? And you're right. So this is the long-range history of processes of indigenization or inculturation of Islam, as they're called. How to speak the languages of the many prophets leading up to Prophet Muhammad in the local language, in this case, Bengali, and of course, across the subcontinent, Gujarati, Tamil, Punjabi, and so on. And I can't remember actually his dates, but I think something around 1650. And
Right.
the Quran is translated in its completion into Bengali again, I can't remember the dates, but let's say around 1880 by somebody from a Hindu background, Girish Chandra Bose. He is a
Right.
member of the Brahmo Samaj, right? So till the Quran is translated into Bengali in its completion, till sometime around 1880, Bengali-speaking Muslims, they don't have a book to read because many of them are illiterate and they cannot read Arabic or Persian. Many of them cannot even read Bengali. So Sayyid Sultan's Novi Bombshell becomes their source of Islamic doctrine for about 2 centuries, and it's a very important, influential text. And just look at the word Novi Bombshell. It's a hybrid Bengali Arabic word. I mean, Nobi is an Arabic Persian word, and Bongsha or Vamsa is a Sanskrit word. So the lineage of Nabis, the lineage or the line or tradition of prophets. And there's a very interesting, important book which you may wish to read. If I remember correctly, the title of the book is Muhammad Avatara, and
Right.
with us,
Aisha Irani.
yes, that's the book. So
Yes.
in fact, for the bit on Syed Sultan for my book, I have drawn almost entirely
Right.
on her PhD dissertation. This is where I encountered the figure of Syed Sultan in the first place.
Mm.
So this very attempt to configure hybrid forms of liminal language, sometimes it's called Musalmani Bangla. So it's a kind of a Bengali where many of the words are ultimately from Arabic or Persian. In fact, when I translate Qazi Nozrul Islam, I'm very heavily dependent on this online dictionary called Rekta, because I cannot read the Arabic script. So I take a certain word in Qazi Nozrul Islam song or poem, and I say, that word does not look Sanskritic, does it? Okay, let's check it out. So I put it into Rekta, and more often than not, it does turn out to be an Arabic or Persian word. But because Nozrul is part of this evolving tradition, he does it so skillfully that no Persian or Arabic word kind of stands out. The effect is not jarring to the ear. It's not like you are speaking Bengali and every now and then you keep on dropping some Arabic or Persian phrases, which, I mean, there's a way to do this too. Say, I can speak to you in straightforward Hindi, or I can speak to you in highly Sanskritized Hindi. In fact, in some ways, highly Sanskritized Hindi comes more naturally to me, even because I read kind of various kind of Sanskrit texts. But just as one can use a quotidian, everyday register of Hindi and a very highly pure Sanskritized form of Hindi, likewise, one can use Bengali, one can use Musalmani Bengali, one can use heavily Persianized Bengali. I mean, just as there are different styles of Urdu. One is the Urdu, which I call Hindustani. I mean, I don't even distinguish between Hindu and Urdu in one sense. I just say Hindustani. But I know that there is a way of speaking Urdu where I would have to go to Rekhta and say, okay, well, what is that one? What is that one? Right? So, but you're right. I mean, Nozrul is this liminal figure who, of course, marries a woman from a Hindu background. I have not been able to find much biographical details about her when I was doing my research, but from what I can understand, she remained a kind of a Hindu-Muslim liminal figure throughout her life. She used to sign her name as, I think, Promila Nozrul Islam. And she, I understand, is buried right now along with Nozrul, I think, near Dhaka. So I mean, again, I may have got some of these details wrong, but yes, I mean, one of the reasons why I dedicated one full chapter to Nozrul Islam is because I mean, he's a truly remarkable figure in these liminal locations, and when you are a liminal figure, you get exposed to fire from both ends. So he was exposed to fire from some Muslim audiences, from some Hindu audiences, none of whom quite understood what are you doing. I mean, are you really a Muslim? How can you write all these beautiful poems in the genre of bhakti? Should you even be using these words like Krishna, like Devi, names of Hindu gods and goddesses? So why don't you stick to the straight path? And that's it. I mean, what kind of Islam are you doing, right? And many Hindus, of course, again, they had their own peculiar views about why is this happening? I mean, what is this Muslim trying to do? So this is one of the many tragic figures in the history of the subcontinent.
Right.
People who engage in this kind of cross-border traffic and they get hit by trucks from both sides of the road.
Mm. Right. Uh, there's also that uh, you quote Nazrul Islam in your book about this. It's an extended quote, but I'd just like to read out
Yeah.
the last one or two lines where he says that his practice of using both Hindu as well as Muslim, metaphors and names of gods and goddesses is because he says, I have complete faith in the union of Hindus and Muslims to strike blows at their prejudices, i.e., at those people who accuse him of, unnecessarily bringing Hindu elements into your, Muslim devotional expression or bringing Muslim elements into Bengali language. He says that to strike blows at their prejudices, I use words by Muslims in the names of Hindu gods and goddesses. So, as you mentioned, he was at the, in the, crosshairs of, fire from both of these sides.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he was at the crossroads, the crosshairs,
Right.
just kind of like a trans-border, transversal, transgressive even figures who try to mediate these kinds of binaries. And I mean, let's say we don't know much about the history of figures like Kabir. I mean, possibly what we have is more of hagiography than biography or history. But figures like Kabir, I'm sure, would have encountered this kind of opposition and struggle in their own times. I'm talking about a Kabir from what century would we say? 15th century? 14, 15,
Right.
15. Yeah, I'm very bad
Right.
with
14 to
these dates
15.
now.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I'm talking about that Kabir. So uh, and again, I mean, again, Kabir is just one figure of in the whole Sant tradition, as we call it. Uh, but you're right that the question of language becomes very important. That the how these concepts, say language, religion, region, and nation state, these four categories may or may not overlap in the case of certain individuals, and when they don't overlap, this generates anxiety in neighbors, in people around you, in your interlocutors, in your dialogical partners, in members of your sampradaya or your community or your silsila or your deen or your dharma. Yeah, so this is the language we use to talk about religion in South Asia. And in an ideal world, let's say all these categories, they fall in place. That is, if you speak this language, you can only belong to this religion, and you have to be only from this region, and you are a member only of this nation state. But whether for better or worse, human history is not that. It's simply not shaped like that. So there's one region, one religion, one nation state. They may or may not overlap, and these are the fragments of history, the fragments of human history who get singled out for fire because people around them don't know how to locate them, how to situate them. And when they don't know how to locate them, how to situate them, there's anxiety of mislocation or dislocation can be deeply unnerving, because it's seen as a threat to their sense of identity. If you are A,
Right.
you have to do B, C,
Right.
and not D.
Mm.
Full stop. No discussion, no argument.
Right. I mean, another fascinating quote from Nazrul Islam. He was accused of being a foreigner, a Yavan or a Jaban, and also accused of being a kafir. But he says, I say that I am neither. I have merely attempted to bring Hindus and Muslims together in one place and get them to shake hands with one another and transform their abuses into embraces. Right.
Yeah. So this kind of creative transmutation of hatred
Mm.
into empathy, that you use the language of poetry, um, a zikr from the Arabic word for remembrance
Right.
of God, or bhakti poem, bhakti poetry. And it's good that you mentioned this word zabon in Bangla from the Sanskrit Yavana. And this
Right.
Sanskrit word Yavana actually refers to the Greeks, to the
Mm.
Ionians. And this reflects my point about vision of austerity. So you can see it goes all
Mm.
the way back to the Greeks. The Greeks are the peripheries. They are the outsiders. They are the enemy at the gates of the Indus in this case. And
Mm.
and this vision of some kind of an outsider going to invade the northwest frontier, whether the river Indus itself or the Hindu Kush mountains, as they're called, as maybe they're still called now that. So this sense of anxiety, threat, that we are a besieged self, besieged both by fifth columnists, the resident aliens within the self, and people more clearly on the peripheries. These are competing visions of the Hindu self, just as we are right now discussing some competing visions of the Islamic self. And when these competing visions of the Hindu vision of austerity collide directly with a Muslim vision of austerity, now that is a quasi-apocalyptic battle, is it not? I mean, because then what happens is that the two sides, they only reinforce one another. Like they kind of just I mean, it confirms your worst suspicions about the other. I told you so, Muslims are like that. I told you so, Hindus are like that. Didn't I say this, right? And this becomes a kind of a dialectical feedback loop, which can rapidly spiral out of control, right? Because that's what I said. Muslims are like they're so austere, so narrow-minded, so insular, so bigoted. That's what I said. Hindus are like so austere, so narrow-minded, so bigoted. So the challenge, of course, of peacemaking, of remaking history is to somehow trying to break the circuit. I mean, how to break the circuit before it, like goes spirals out of control. And I mean, Tagore often talks about the bowls, and he talks about various
Right.
Sufi sages and saints. I mean, maybe he does not himself use the word Sufi, but he's talking about these Muslim individuals as well. So, I mean, to put it very bluntly, we can think of these bowls, some kind of Hindu gurus, some Muslim Sufi figures as circuit breakers, right? They break the circuit of violence before it spirals out of control, and channels that violence towards circuits of empathy.
Right.
Whatever is the language, the distinctive language they use. Somebody may use the language of Tawheed and Zikir, situating it on a certain horizon. And then here the language, more common language would be, say, Atman, Ishwara, Bhakti, and so on. And how, to go back to one of your previous points, how even when the history of the world shows us that there are patterns of antagonism, the history of the world also shows us that there are these currents, sometimes subterranean, of empathy, of amity, of mutual understanding. I can't remember who said this. It could have been Tagore himself. I think it was Tagore himself who made this point in a very different context. He says, when we read the newspapers, we only read about how many people got killed, for what reason, in what form of violence, but we don't read about how one neighbor was helping another neighbor for some reason. And so human benevolence and goodness, however scarce it may be, is real, and it does not get reported in newspapers. So that is like, okay, but when there's a road accident or a riot or violence, it gets reported. I mean, yes, I mean, it should get reported, but because the other things don't get that kind of publicity, we may forget that it also happens in the backdrop, in the background.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, that was just to comment on how Nozrul was trying to mediate. He was a kind of a culture broker. He was trying to call a brokerage, to find some kind of intellectual, spiritual brokerage between two seemingly vastly divided universes, which are distinct, of course, in many ways. But as I said some time ago, that not every difference has to be a binary. We can be different, but we don't have to be separated by some kind of binary opposition.
So you also mentioned the bowls, the
Yeah.
music and the songs of the bowls. Of course, Anne-Marie Schimmel writes about Bengali mystical poems that they are so close to the Hindu tradition. I mean these poems written by Muslims, they're so close to the Hindu tradition, so that the flute of Lord Krishna and the flute of which Maulana Rumi sing become at times interchangeable. I find this really fascinating, where you have this kind of the Rumi's reed flute, which speaks of, or which laments of separation from its source or from its reed bed, and you have this Vaishnavite verses talking about the lamentation of the soul and the pain of separation. So the Baul Sangeet is a good illustration of this kind of uh, I suppose this I mean it's an alternative to the kind of different anxieties that are running about purity and pollution with regard to language and identity.
Yes, I mean language and identity and social ritual practices of caste as well, like jati and varna.
Right.
So that's another set of arguments altogether.
Right.
Yes, I mean, Baos are these kind of again liminal groups. Sometimes the word syncretic is used, and some people don't like the word syncretic. Partly for that reason, I prefer the term synthetic. But again, possibly what I mean by synthetic is what they mean by syncretic. So it's just a kind of word game. But let's say at the very least there are liminal groups. And liminal in the sense that certain kinds of modular Hindu versus Muslim categories cannot be applied. Often their language resonates with Hindu forms of yoga, breath control, control of attention, attentive vision, cultivation of certain virtues of empathy, of regard for the other, and so on. And of course, often they use words from Arabic words, words which are part of wider Sufi universes. So these are Hindu-Muslim patterns of trying to find meaning in the world, trying to answer questions about God and humanity. And, I mean, in one sense, sometimes when I think about bounds, sometimes I think about how religious identities, they can get very ugly when people become too obsessively self-concerned about their identity. But when I think about many of my Muslim and Christian friends, acquaintances, relatives in India, in a certain sense, they are almost unself-consciously quote unquote Hindu. And what I mean by that is the fluency with which I can say, oh, when Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata said this and dot dot dot, and they follow the argument. I mean, they may not have themselves read the Ramayana or the Mahabharata or even the Gita, but they kind of get it. I mean, it's somewhere in the air. And I'm not talking about some book published in Latin America in 1450. It's kind of part of the wider cultural atmosphere, cultural ethos. Now, of course, it's a very different argument altogether when certain demands are made that, okay, you have to conform to this way of being Hindu or this style of Hindu identity. But in everyday normal conversation over telephone or having dinner or having a chai or a cup of tea, I don't say things like, okay, you're Muslim. Just hold on. I'm going to say something from the Ramayana. It's okay. I just say, okay, here it is. And this happened and this happened. And they may not understand what happened, but can say, okay, this is what happened. And surely you know that, this is the style of everyday conversation where people are not too caught up about, did that reference come from that surah or ayah, or did that reference come from this particular verse in the Bhagavad Gita? Somehow the concepts, the basic idioms are more or less intelligible to some people, actually. I mean, and by some people, I mean some Hindus as well as some Muslims. The problem, of course, starts when we start having these kind of conversations about borderlines. Okay, when I drop that reference to this particular Hindu deity or that particular Hindu practice, did I cross a line? Did I step on someone's toes? Or did you suddenly become Hindu because I said this, right? So this kind of micro negotiations, which can happen, but they don't have to happen between friends and acquaintances where certain some rules of engagement are understood. I mean, nowadays they call it a safe space, but even without thinking of that category, I mean, what we call safe space sometimes in some contexts is, I would say, the kind of conversation we can have in a small road or in an alley in some part of Delhi or Aligarh when having tea. So again, there is a threat of romanticization, but keeping that threat in mind, I would still like to believe it happens.
Right. Well, I mean, I suppose, part of me wants to pull on the string about the why syncretic is such a problematic term.
Okay.
And why people might have anxieties about that.
Okay.
And I mean, can we speak about these things without passing value judgments about them, whether or not, we are recommending being syncretic or not being syncretic is a good thing to do.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, many of these terms, they seem descriptive when you hear them or you see them, but they're actually deeply normative or kind of prescriptive. So when somebody says that is syncretic, they're not just saying, okay, this has happened. They're also saying, at least as a footnote, don't do that. Or alternatively, wonderful, bravo, do that.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Right.
and that's partly why I prefer liminal, because I mean, liminal can also have a normative, evaluative edge to
Right.
it. But I think liminal usually does not have too many of
Hmm.
those connotations, I would like to think. Also, at least synthetic. I mean, synthetic seems to be fairly innocent of these evaluative, normative associations. If I say synthetic, I'm simply saying two things are moving in the same field of force. It's just a historical comment. It's a historical sociological observation. Whether I approve of it or prohibit it or disapprove of it is the next conversation to be had. Right? So I mean, the very fact that syncretic is such a contested term goes back to my point about vision of austerity, is it not? Right? That there is a vision of a pure self, trans-historical essence, which is somehow beyond time and space, beyond history, beyond culture. And when this pure self, whether Hindu or Muslim, it touches history, society, culture, it gets contaminated. So don't do that. Don't do sociology or anthropology or history and things like that. Retrieve the pure essence of the Hindu self or the Muslim self to be found in the Quran or the Upanishads or some scriptural text. I mean, again, not to say that the scriptural texts are not relevant. I mean, these are deeply formative of Hindu and Muslim identity. But we don't have to operate with this binary, either or, between text and context. It's not that there is a pure Muslim or Hindu self somewhere out there located in some text. And whenever this text hits the rough ground of social reality, it can only get contaminated because we can try to find new meanings to the Quran, new meanings to the Upanishads, precisely within those socio-economic crucibles, within these social historical contexts, right? Otherwise, there will be some kind of a radical bipolarity between a pure essence, which is beyond time and space, and this world, which is completely depraved and degenerate. Right? We don't want to set up this kind of a radical duality.
Right.
To make that we do somehow to find the signs of God or the presence of the divine in the here and now, in all the messiness, in all the complexities of everyday social life. So to run away from history, to run away from these kinds of social contaminations by calling them contamination, is to implicitly endorse a kind of duality, which these texts may not endorse.
Right. And of course, that duality is also an imaginary duality because, I mean, in reality, you are, I mean, even those who would want to run away from history or want to eschew any historical adulteration of this, supposedly pristine self that is out there, they also forget that I mean, there is no such self outside of history, and if you believe that there is an ahistorical self, it's only because you are unaware of the historical influences upon your own self and upon the formation of the socio-historical formations that have gone behind the self that you have inherited. So in reality, there is no such thing, and it's I mean it's only delusional in one sense to think so.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, what you say, I agree with it. But just to put a small twist to it, even if you say that there is a spiritual self, a transcendental self beyond time and space and history, your argument holds even then, because even then, what I will say to that is that, yes, in the light of the Quran or in the light of the Gita or light of some particular scriptural horizon, I believe that there is a spiritual core which is beyond time and space and history. But I can add to this by saying, but that spiritual core is known perfectly, completely only to God, not to me.
Right, of
Therefore, so
course.
long as I am within human history, I have to operate within the bounds of historical parameters, right? So even with people who would say that there is a pure self, I would have no problem because I would just try to remind them that, look, maybe so, but not yet. I mean, I mean, at least
Ah,
I don't know what that pure self would look like. So even without denying the possibility that maybe in the eyes of God, in the vision of God, or some ultimate reality, that will be known completely to you one day as you are known, but we are not there yet. So till we get there, we have to operate within the spatial-temporal constraints that we have, and taking these spatial-temporal constraints as, in some sense, grounded in ultimate reality, and not setting up this duality. Okay? So
right.
on both readings, number one, let's say the strong reading that there is no such self beyond history, and my reading that there is such a self beyond history,
Right, but it's
what
only
we
known to
want to
God.
say still goes through.
Right, of course. Right, definitely. I mean, for our access, it's not accessible,
Yeah.
but it's known to God. And also, this is also true about scripture. For example, the Quran itself. Um, uh, no one can arguably claim that we have, I mean, understood the mind of God, or this is what God actually wants to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can only interpret it through our own lenses.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, there is a famous statement attributed to the Prophet's companion Ali about this, where he says that the Quran doesn't speak for itself. So it is only we who give voice to it through our interpretations.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
And
I
that, as you can
mean,
see,
right.
both
Yeah.
in Islam and in Hinduism, generates all kinds of anxieties about how much of agency are you giving to the hermeneut or to the exegete in performing
Right.
this tafsir or bhashya, that
Right.
somehow, are we saying that somehow the Quran becomes true through my speaking it? Or am I saying that somehow the Bhagavad Gita was not true till this morning when I started commenting on it, right? So how much of agency is to be given to the human individual? And this is a common theological problem in both in Islamic
Mm.
theology and in Hindu theology. That is how to, as it were, reconcile is not the right word, but let me use it anyway. How to reconcile divine agency with human agency? I mean, that is a whole a set of philosophical theological problems about human free will, divine predestination, divine foreknowledge. But only because you noted this, I'm
Mm.
commenting on it. That yes, I
Right.
mean. I mean, for a finite human being to claim to know what the Quran is in its completeness, with absolute apodictic certainty, as it is called, I mean, would be a form of cognitive idolatry.
Right. Of course.
It would be a form of shirk, setting oneself up as God in some sense, like kind of
Mm.
quasi-omniscient figure that this is what the Quran means. So I mean, I would like to think that this is a pretty uh, established view, even in
Right.
Quranic circles, Islamic circles, that we can only say, to the best of my knowledge, this is what the Quran says, and then add, and Allah knows best.
Right. Right. Of
I
course.
mean, that's why the phrase is added, and God knows
Mm.
best. That
Right.
I have spent 20 years working on the text of the Quran, and not me, like hypothetical. I have spent all this time reading dot 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 dot, and here's my 3-volume tafsir of the Quran. And then when all that is done, and God knows best.
Right.
And
Well, yeah.
one Hindu version of doing this particular thing is to add this poetic flourish that, okay, I have written this bhashya, I have written this commentary on the great works of my guru, not because I have anything to add to what the guru knew, because the guru by definition cannot know less relative to me, but only to highlight certain points which the guru may not have touched upon, right? So this is often that verse you find in many Hindu sub commentaries of a commentary. And of course, this sub commentary goes on to make some quite radical claims which are not found in the text of the guru. But even so, you have to start with this disclaimer that no, dear Guru, I'm commenting on your text, not because I want to teach you what you did not know, because by definition, that's impossible. But just to tell my audiences, what that meant, what you meant by that particular verse, because you did not seem to have commented on it sufficiently. Right? So that is this um, practice of self-negation, even as you are affirming your own reading. Right? So the Guru is an embodiment, in this case, let's say, of God, who is absolutely omniscient. and the Guru has a fraction of that omniscience, and I, a humble disciple of the Guru, have 0.0000001% of that omniscience, if that, maybe even not that, right? So just to give you one example of what you were saying, that how in an Islamic circle, Muslim theologians, exegetes would not usually claim to have come up with the one final absolute reading of the Quran. I mean, that is
right,
for us to know on the day of judgment.
right, of course.
If
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
patient enough, if you have the sabr, then we will have to wait
right.
and see. Okay, what was it about then?
Right, of course. I mean, that's what the Quran says repeatedly.
Yeah,
I mean, we'll inform you on the day of judgment about all that you used to differ
yeah,
about. So, I
yeah,
mean, these differences are there to stay,
yeah,
and epistemic certainty is perhaps not something meant for this world.
yeah. I
So,
mean, given this kind of
right.
epistemic distance between us, finite knowers, and the absolute omniscient knower, this
Mm,
epistemic distance is a constitutive part of our finitude. So
right.
that's why I use the word sabr, like patience. What can we do but to
Mm,
cultivate this virtue of patience, that we just have to accept it?
right.
And to some of us, that patience may not come easily. Some of us may find it easier to cultivate it, but
Right.
that is a matter of human temperament, right?
Right. I mean, this of course reminds me of another really interesting verse in the Quran, which says that we have made each of you a test for each other to see whether you will be patient, whether you'll have sabr,
Yes.
uh, which is interesting.
Yeah, so the universe is
Yeah.
a laboratory of
Mm,
patience in that
mm,
sense.
right.
We're carrying out these creative experiments with one another, trying to test each other's patience, hopefully not in a negative sense, but in a positive way.
Right. 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 Well, I suppose, I mean, that was a separate tangent. And if we could come back to uh, discussing, I suppose, Rabindranath Tagore's writings in the book which you have translated
Yeah,
about Hindu-Muslim uh, relations. Uh, of course, Tagore expresses at so many places that it is our great responsibility. It is almost a divine responsibility for Hindus and Muslims to love one another. And I mean, this is something which, of course, they're speaking about this. I mean, Nazrul Islam is also talking about this. They're speaking about this in the context where there was also some talk of Hindu-Muslim unity, but for certain political exigency or expediency,
yeah,
right? And as opposed to that, Nazrul Islam and Rabindranath Tagore want to talk about a more deeper amity between Hindus and Muslims. Can you
yeah.
talk about that? No?
Yeah, so it's good that you highlight this point, because this point does come up repeatedly in Nazrul and Tagore, and also in Ondota Shankarai,
Right,
where they're trying to situate Hindu-Muslim patterns of engagement on a horizon of, say, religious humanism. And of course, for Nazrul, this religious humanism is also deeply shaped by the language of Islam. And for Tagore, it is shaped by the language of the Upanishads and the Gita, more so the
right,
Upanishads. And what all these three figures, I mean, when I started working on this book, I mean, I had no clue that all these three figures, they kind of agree on this fundamental leitmotif that runs through the book. You know, it's one thing led to another, one thing led to another. So I was pleasantly surprised to see them resonating on this particular view. And what they're trying to say is this: say, often what happens in so-called Hindu-Muslim dialogue or Hindu-Christian dialogue, or I would think possibly even Christian-Muslim dialogue, is that this dialogue is not really a dialogue of one heart speaking to another heart. It's more like trying to figure out, okay, these are the things I should not say about Muslims. Okay, these are the things I should not say about Hindus. These are the things I should not say about Christians. You know, this kind of very passive way of knowing your boundary lines. Okay, these things are not safe. These things are what they do. But that is not really what Tagore and Nazrul will call a dialogue of one heart speaking to the other heart, where there is an attitude of, to use this word, which is extensively used in North India, in Punjabi, in Hindi, Bengali, of Sahaj, you know, this kind of spontaneous sociality, where we are not worried too much about, you know, I mean, is it okay if I cite a verse from the ayah or the surah? Say, when I speak to my Muslim friends, that kind of thought will never come to me. That, okay, just hold on. Now I'm going to cite from the ayah. Is it okay? Or, say, for example, if a Muslim friend of mine were to seek permission from me, okay, I'm going to cite a verse now from the Bhagavad Gita. Is that okay with you? So that would be the breakdown of Sahaj, according to Tagore and Nazrul. This kind of human sociality, this kind of human spontaneity, which he believes we should be able to find the source, the spring of that spontaneity in the deep self, which is somehow related to the divine self. And because the divine self is omnipresent, the divine self is as much in you as in your neighbor, the divine self is as much in the self as in the other. Therefore, between the self and the other, there's no radical rupture or disjunction. The human self and the human other are embedded in patterns of relationality, which are grounded in the divine self. And that's what I mean by religious humanism. It's not just humanism, looking for the humanity of the neighbor, looking for the humanity of the neighbor and seeing that humanity grounded on a transcendental plane is religious humanism, which for Tagore is, as I said, ultimately stemming from the Upanishads as understood by the Brahma Samaj, and for Nazrul from this particular style of Bengali Sufi understanding. So, say, to go back to this phrase I used a while ago, a safe space. Of course, in many conflict zones of the world, that is just what we need, safe space. But say from Tagore's and Nazrul's point of view, we have to go to the next step, beyond safe space. Because the very moment we say safe space, we are highlighting the fact that once we enter into the safe space, you have to be a certain kind of person. In one sense, you stop being yourself because you become even more hyper aware that the other person is a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian. You are speaking a certain kind of language, right? So the point is not that Tagore and Nazrul would have opposed the idea of a safe space, but they would say that is only version 1.0. There is a version 2.0, which is finding this virtue of Sahaj within the deep self. And this again is what I mean by vision of abundance. But of course, to what extent this vision of abundance can be concretized or performed in real historical situations will depend on the underlying surrounding socioeconomic parameters, right? So say, for example, if you and I are in a conflict zone and we are fighting over a loaf of bread, it may be more difficult for us to cultivate this vision of abundance, and it may be easier for us to cultivate a vision of austerity. I say maybe because, you may be the greatest Sufi saint in the world, and you say, oh, what is a loaf of bread to me? I mean, brother, you're my brother, so it depends on who we are. But let's say, generally speaking, among human beings, we need some time, we need some space, we need a certain kind of freedom to activate or reactivate this vision of abundance within us. And it's more difficult, it's not impossible, it's more difficult to cultivate this vision of abundance within conditions of austerity. Right. So that also is a kind of answer to your question a while ago about, is it the case that we become aware of self only in conditions of antagonism? Maybe not so. There are Sufi saints, various kinds of pious Muslims, various kinds of Hindu bhaktas who will be like, doesn't matter where I am. I can be in 1947, 1971. My brother is still my brother. My sister is still my sister. But human frailty is such that we are not structured that way. We are not constituted that way to feel this kind of radical altruism. Does not come easily to us. It requires cultivation, sadhana, to use the Sanskrit term.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a long answer to, I think, what you're asking.
Right. Yeah. Right.
That is what Tagore goes on and on and on in his writings. In fact, I can't remember this figure, Josimuddin. So I mean, somewhere in my book, there's an episode where a Bengali poet called Josimuddin, and Josimuddin writes in his in his autobiography that whenever Tagore would meet this Bengali poet, I think he's now a major poet in the textbooks in Bangladesh. He would always start talking about this problem, that why is there this absence of sociality, this kind of spontaneous feeling of brotherhood, sisterhood, amity, and even Joshimuddin was deeply pained, and I could see this when I was reading his reminiscences of his time with Tagore. So that is as I said, Tagore goes on and on and on, and so does Nazrul. That why is there this absence? Is there lament that is expressed very vividly in a lot of poetry, a lot of their prose writings? This absence of what I'm calling shahaj, this attitude where um, there are differences, there are distinctions, but there are no binaries. That very subtle distinction between affirming differences but not affirming a binary is what I'm calling this attitude of sahaj, where you can feel at peace, just say it, whatever it is from the Quran you want to say, no problem. That is the difference I'm willing to affirm while interrogating the notion of a binary, and that is made possible through this affective bond of sahaj.
Right.
And what their claim is that once this affective bond of sahaj is somehow in place, political rewirings on pieces of paper are neither here nor there. Right? I think on Noda Shankar Rai, in one of the essays I translate, he notes this. I mean, it's just an episode, so one should not make a whole argument out of an episode. So he says that one of his Muslim neighbors who went to Pakistan after the partition, he would every year send him a piece of khadi cloth he would spin on a charkha, on a wheel. So this is a Muslim individual who goes to Pakistan after 47. And he sends him Anota Shankar Roy in Bengal after 47, that piece of cloth, khadi cloth. So I mean, and he narrates this with a lot of affection and with a lot of feeling that, look, here is what I mean when I say we are not two Bengals. I mean, we are two different communities, but in one Bengal. That is Anota Shankar Rai's point. But anyway, that is just to give you one episode. And as I said, one narrative, one episode does not make a whole argument. But these narratives, these episodes are also important to keep in mind.
Right. Right. And well, I mean, you also talk about the context of Tagore's family itself, which was, which saw this confluence of the two, Hindu and Muslim worlds in their family. And of course, this is also coming from the Brahmo Samaj background that Rabindranath's father, Debindranath, was of.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So the Tagore family was a kind of confluence, a meeting point of various Hindu and Indo-Islamic currents, or even Indo-Persian currents, because the poet whom Debindranath was fond of quoting and reciting entire verses from was Hafiz. And it's been a while since I read these texts, but I vaguely remember one place where one of his friends, of Debendranath's friends, says he recounts an episode where Debendranath, it seems, in the middle of a conversation, he suddenly stood up and he recited a whole series of verses from Hafiz, and his whole face was glowing and beaming with joy. Right? So Hafiz had a very powerful impact on Debendranath, and in one place, Rabindranath, the son, he describes his father, Debendranath, as the bulbul of Persia. This is the nightingale who is reciting all these beautiful songs, and he is both a bulbul and I think he said he's a sage, he's a rishi. So he's a sage, he's a Vedic seer, he's a Vedic well, I don't want to say prophet, but a Vedic sage, and here's a nightingale. So this kind of resonance or harmony even between a vision deeply steeped in the Upanishads and a vision coming out from Persia. Yes. I mean, the Tagore family was, of course, quite an interesting family. I mean, not just Rabindranath. I mean, he just happens to be maybe the most well-known member of the family. I think the first son, the eldest son, I think it was Satyendranath Tagore. He was the first ICS officer, if my facts are right. I think so. The Indian Civil Service, Satyendranath Tagore. And many of the women in that family were pioneers in their own right of various kinds of what today we would call women's emancipation. There is a member, there is a lady in that family with a very, very long name, which I simply cannot say, so I will not say it. But it seems that she developed the sari that many women, Hindu and Muslim and Christian in India today wear, based on a model she saw in Mumbai, in Bombay, Parsi women. So she configured the sari, the present day style of the sari, was configured by a woman, by a lady in the Tagore family. I mean, just a small episode to tell you what I mean when I say, it was a very significant group of people in the
Right.
Brahmo Samaj. Yes, but
Right.
but yes, I mean, Tagore is possibly, as I say, the most well known of these
Right.
members, these people in that family.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, even these writings of Tagore about Muslims and about the Hindu-Muslim question were themselves not so well known, I suppose, or at least in
And
the
I
English
said,
language. Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, when I started translating
Mm.
one and followed by another, I was
Right.
just struck. I was like astounded. I was like, when did you have the time and the
Mm.
energy and the patience and this high reflective power? Because sometimes
Mm.
Rabindranath Tagore is not somebody who's taken seriously. It's like, oh, you mean that guy who keeps on writing poems and songs? Oh, very beautiful man.
Mm.
Fine. Let's move on to some serious stuff. I mean, whether Tagore or Nehru or Radhakrishnan or whatever. Um, One, not the reason, but one of the many reasons why I keep on working on Tagore is just to highlight the point that he's a very serious, articulate, reflective thinker who writes serious stuff. And 28,000 words on Bengal's Hindus, the Hindu-Muslim question. As I said, it is a lot of prose, 20,000 words in my translation into English. And
Right.
most other Hindus, contemporary Hindus, they may have written one essay or a newspaper article or
Mm.
maybe a short story. By the way, again, my facts are often not right these days. But I think the last story that Tagore wrote, or the second last story, is simply called in the translation in English, "The Muslim Woman." And this is about how I think a Hindu woman goes into the house of a Muslim or something else, something happens, right? So the fact that the
Mm.
last story he wrote was about a Muslim woman or a Hindu woman who becomes Muslim or something like this. Someone again, this borderline traffic, borderline crossing shows how deeply he was consumed by the Hindu-Muslim question. It kept on troubling him. It was, as Josimuddin writes in that
Mm.
autobiography, whenever he would meet the Kobi Guru, that is Tagore, he would say, okay, let's talk about this Hindu-Muslim problem now. So
Right.
yes, a significant amount of writing on this problem, this question, can be found in Tagore, and that's one of the many reasons why I transmuted these translations into a book, because I did not want this translation to just remain on my laptop. I said, okay, let people read them if they wish to. What Tagore has to say in 1905, at the time of the Swadeshi movement, Swadeshi agitation, 1905, the first partition of Bengal. And later on in the late 1920s, during the communal riots in Calcutta in 1923, 24, and later on, yes. Yes, you're right. I
Right.
mean, there's a
Right.
huge amount of literature from him.
Right. I think we've touched upon certain key, motifs from your book so far, and perhaps one final uh, point which we might want to discuss is the figure of another Shankar Rai.
Yeah.
Right? Can you speak a little bit about him and where he is situated in these discussions?
Yeah. So, um, yes, it's good that you mention Ananda Shankar Rai, because I think before I started working on this book, I knew the name because I may have seen books by him in some bookshop or in some library. Now, this is a kind of serendipity, as we call it, that is chance, luck, good fortune. So when I was translating all this stuff of Tagore. Of course, I knew about Nazrul. And so I said, okay, let's have a Muslim voice, a fairly straightforward Muslim voice. So that's why I moved to Nazrul. And as it so happens, at least two of the essays I've translated from Nazrul, Nazrul himself mentions Tagore. He says, one day I was talking to Kobi Guru, and again the same problem. This Hindu-Muslim relations. So Kobi Guru was talking to Nazrul about why is this happening? Why are they fighting? What can we do? And so Nazrul starts one of these essays by mentioning Tagore himself. I mean, that's not why I translated that essay. I just wanted to find something from Nazrul. I would have been happier if Nazrul had not mentioned Tagore there, but he has. What can I do? And then I think Nazrul somewhere mentions Ananda Shankar Rai, right? And I was like, who is this Ananda Shankar Rai? Why is it so important to Nazrul? And yes, I think that's how it happened. And then I realized that yes, Ananda Shankar Rai, who, as I said, was an ICS officer. I think, yeah, I mean, he is Bengali. That is, he's from a Bengali-speaking family, but he grew up in Orissa. And then he took the civil services exam, and then he was posted in different parts of Bengal, East Bangladesh, I mean, East Pakistan. After, no, can't be East Pakistan. I mean, like what is today Bangladesh, East Pakistan. He was posted there. And he has very similar views, very similar motives. I mean, as it so happens, he did know Tagore and Nazrul in person. I mean, he did meet both of them on some occasions. And once again, we find very similar themes, this note of religious humanism, that we can, as it were, socially engineer Hindu-Muslim unity by making proclamations from some public podium or some platform, or making big speeches at political rallies, or even implementing some policies in a top-down manner and saying, Hindu-Muslim unity, here we go, or Hindus and Muslims become united because these are certain gains to be made if you come together and vote in this way. But his point, echoing what Nazrul and Tagore were saying in a different context, is that unless you have this heart-to-heart relationality, what I'm calling the language of Sahaj, Ananda may have used this word Sahaj himself. Maybe that's where I also found it. We cannot have this kind of true harmony or understanding or mutual intelligibility. And he often gives narratives, episodes from his own encounters with Bengali Muslims in the Mofasil areas of Bengal, like kind of not big towns and cities like Dhaka or Murshidabad, but small villages where he talks about some of these Bengali Muslims he meets and his encounters with them, his engagements with them, and a lot of his prose writings. You can see, I mean, this is what I learned about him from his biography, but you can see how his writings are kind of reflected. I mean, in his writings are reflected some of his engagements with these Bengali Muslims. And again, I mean, that's all I have to say for now. But I mean, one reason why Ananda Shankar Rai is a very important figure, at least for me in this book, is because Ananda Shankar Rai lives till 2002, again, if I remember my dates correctly. So he's somebody who lives across the 1947 threshold and across the 1971 threshold. And then he makes some very, very interesting remarks about Pakistan, East Pakistan, West Pakistan, that Pakistan, and Hindu-Muslim relations in India, in post-independence India and pre-independence India. And again, there is recurring throughout his reflections is the note of deep lament and anguish. And at the same time, these episodes where he says, look, here is one occasion where this is what I'm talking about when I say Sahaj, when I say this is the Muslim friend of mine who did this. This is the Muslim figure whom I'm talking about, or this is the Hindu person who did this. Yeah? So on the one hand, again, there's a backdrop of antagonism, asymmetry, hierarchy, domination, and oppression. And within that backdrop, there are these enclaves of friendship and interrelationality that is sketching. Right? So you can say it's a very complex picture. It's neither this or that. It's not like, okay, Hindus and Muslims, friends forever, BFF, best friends forever, right? BFF.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not Hindus and Muslims BFF, nor is it Hindus and Muslims who have been locked in this mortal combat since the beginning of time until the end of time, that is Judgment Day. So neither of these two bipolar representations with which I think we started this conversation. And then
Right.
partly because he's again located in the social space, the social messiness, this kind of anguish, this lament is very vivid in his writings. That how did this come to be? I think in one place he says very vividly that, when the Desh was Vibhakta, when the country was partitioned, we did not, because we could not possibly partition the Taj Mahal. So the Taj Mahal is both this and this. And for him, the Taj Mahal becomes symbolic of this form of harmony, let's say, without romanticizing it, because he's very aware of the deep, long-range socioeconomic asymmetries. But this lament over a nation that has become somehow split, because he does not believe that Hindus and Muslims form two distinct communities. I mean, partition has happened, he writes, well, so be it. It's a political move. But how to maintain these bonds of Sahaj is his question to us today. I mean, from those writings in 47, 71. I mean, that's what I have to say about
Right.
Andota Shangore for now.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, he also, of course, interestingly mentions that you cannot partition Ghalib or Rabindranath
Yeah.
either. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And in one of his writings, he even mentions Waris Shah, like the poet of the Punjab, Waris. So,
Right.
does he belong to Punjabis in India? Does he belong to Punjabis in Pakistan? He asks this question. Like, to whom does this poet belong?
Right.
Waris.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I mean,
Right.
these lines drawn on paper, as he says somewhere, but the subterranean currents, they go much deeper. Like dormant or latent, or have been oppressed or sidelined.
Well, Professor, I think we've touched upon some of the key themes from the book, and we've had we've looked at some fascinating possibilities for on the Hindu-Muslim question, and thinking about these questions of language, identity, self, and the other. Right. Is there anything else you would like to add about this book, Professor?
I think now that I think quickly about what I've said, yes, I think that kind of captures the discussion, reflects this key point that I was trying to highlight, how categories like religion, language, region, nation state, they may or may not be overlapping, they may or may not be congruent. And when they are not, this generates all kinds of tragedies in human history. People who fall in between the cracks, people who fall on the margins, on the peripheries, who are neither here nor there, because you are somehow your religion says you are A, but somehow your nation state says you are B, or somehow your language says you are C, but your religion says you are D. And what do? Do you somehow forcefully, do you recalibrate, rewire your subjectivities in one line, in one direction, or do you say both are absolutely fundamental, vital aspects of my identity? Why do I have to choose between being A or B? For me, it is a both and, it's not an either or, right? And this is a universal human problem in one sense, running throughout human history. But I show this, I articulate the specifically Bengali Muslim, Bengali Hindu expressions of this problem from about 1850 to 2002 in the book. But the problem can be resituated on many other socio-political landscapes and horizons and studied there.
Right.
So that would be kind of like the zoom out lens for, as it were, the takeaway from my book.
Right.
Then even without looking at the specific details of what Tagore may have said about Muslims in 1921, we're using a zoom out lens. This lack of fit sometimes between religion, region, language, and nation state is a human problem that recurs throughout the globe.